All right, everybody, welcome to your One Book Show on this, I don't know what day it is. It's Monday. I don't usually do shows on Monday, but I had some time today. All right, everybody, welcome to your One Book Show. Oh, why are we hearing this twice? It's Monday. I don't usually do shows on Monday, but I had some time. All right, we're going to mute that. All right, now you can only hear me. Just one of me, not two of this. Um, let's see. Let me center myself. All right, there we go. In the picture, I'm still in a hotel room, different hotel, different location. I'm now just north of Miami. Jonathan, thank you. Really appreciate that. And we've got people in Belgium. We've got, all right, Brazil. Ronaldo is here. Not the football soccer player. All right, everybody's here. That's great. So thanks everybody for joining, and welcome again to the One Book Show. No opening music. It's hard to get that going on the road. Let me just close some windows here so I can actually access. It's tough to do the show given how many windows I have open on the road on my little laptop, but so far so good. All right, we're managing. Let me know on the chat if there are any problems or anything happens that disrupt us. I'm hoping to head back home tomorrow. So if that is indeed the case, then I will do a show on I'll do a show on Wednesday. But we'll see. Let me just move the camera a little back. Let me put it a little bit like that. All right, that's better. Although I'm more in the dark here, but so be it. Again, hope everybody's doing well, and let's jump into. We're going to talk today about foreign policy. We'll talk about Russia. We'll talk about what's going on in Russia, what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and the threats of war from Russia, from Putin, and the impact that might have on the United States. We'll talk about the U.S. troops being put on alert, and talk about increasing the number of troops in the Baltics, and so on. Just a reminder: the funding for the show, of the One Book Show, is done through monthly contributions that you can provide. This is the most valuable way in which we fund the show. We make it possible for me to do what I do, to advocate for egoism, individual rights, capitalism, freedom, liberty, and only wars of self-defense. And to do that, to become a monthly supporter, you can do that on youronbookshow.com/support. You can do it on Patreon. You can do it on subscribestar.com/youronbookshow. So lots of different ways in which to support the show. Thank you, Shai. One of the ways in which you can do it, not monthly, although I prefer the monthly methodology, is to support the show here on the Super Chat. We have usually goals for the Super Chat. It's typically $600. It would be great. It would be great if we could achieve that goal today. We're off to Catherine is here to kind of keep track of all of that and to motivate you to participate and to engage and to ask questions. Even more important in some respects than the money, the questions that you ask enrich the show. They allow me to talk about things that obviously interest you because you're asking questions about them. They allow you to expand your knowledge, at least to ask me about what I think about issues that are important to you. So questions don't have to be about the topic of the show, although I give those priorities at the beginning of the show. I also give priority to questions that are funded with $20 or more on the question through the Super Chat. So please feel free to use the Super Chat feature both to support the show and to ask questions that interest you about anything that I'm talking about anything that you think might be of interest, All right. So, as you probably know, and I've talked about in past shows, Putin is amassing troops and weapons on the Ukrainian border since for the last few months. There's about 100,000 Russian troops on the eastern border of Ukraine. there's already a piece of eastern Ukraine that is occupied, if you will, by Russians who are affiliated, ethnic Russians who are affiliated with Russia, but who are Ukrainians technically. And there is ongoing shooting between Ukrainians, people from, the Ukrainians and these Russians insurgents on the sliver on the eastern border. And what I thought I'd do in order to make this a little bit more interesting, and just in the beginning, and we're not going to do this the whole time, is I thought I'd put up a map of Ukraine, which might, I think, because I don't know how many of you know where Ukraine is, know who it borders with, know anything about Ukraine. So I figured I'd put up a map. I like maps. I don't know if you guys like maps, but I really like maps. And I think that if we have a map in front of us, that makes it a little easier to talk about. So hopefully you can see that. Let me know. Whoops. Let me activate the chat. Let me know if you can see the map. Can you see the map? This is a map of kind of Eastern Europe and Russia. Oh God, I have to also copy down the super chat questions. So one second. Michael's jumping in with $20 super chat questions, which is great, but let me just copy those down because otherwise they'll disappear for me on the super chat. And then we'll go back to the map. And Daniel says he can see his house on the map. It's not a satellite image, Daniel. It's a map. Map don't have houses on them. Anyway, here's the map. I don't know. Can you see my mouse as it travels along the map? But this is you can see Ukraine kind of in the center of the map. Let me see. Can you see the mouse? Anybody see the mouse? Okay. So Ukraine has an eastern border with Russia. You can see it down here. This is down in the Black Sea, this kind of islandy looking thing. That is Crimea, which the Russians took a few years ago from Ukraine. And the Russians now occupied, claiming it's their territory. So they don't consider it occupation. Ukraine's capital is Kiev, which is up here, close to the Belarusian border, but not too far from the Russian border. This area on the eastern side on the eastern border of Ukraine is where the Russians kind of have occupied a sliver of that, as where ethnic Russians have claimed that is. It is West Ukraine and Kiev, which are particularly interested in aligning themselves with the West. They do not want to be under the influence of Russia. They are not interested in being a satellite state of the Russians. They would like to see themselves integrated into the European Union and into Europe. They are advocates of and believers of kind of Western values that aren't interested in being under the thumb of Vladimir Putin, the authoritarian dictator of Russia. To the north of Ukraine, you have Belarus. Belarus is a satellite country of Russia. Belarus is a dictatorship. You might have followed some of the news out of Belarus earlier last year, where Belarus, there were a lot of demonstrations in Belarus. Those demonstrations were crushed, and then the Belarusians kind of imported Muslim immigrants into Belarus, put them on the Polish border to try to come into Europe just to antagonize the Europeans. This is Poland. Poland has a border with Ukraine in kind of its northeast section. Slovakia has an eastern border with Ukraine. Hungary has an eastern border with Ukraine. And Romania and Moldova have eastern borders with Ukraine. Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Lithuania to the north, that does not have a border with Ukraine but has a border with Belarus, Latvia, which has a border both with Russia and Belarus, and Estonia, which only has a border with Russia. All of those countries are NATO countries. All of those countries belong to the NATO alliance. Ukraine does not belong to the NATO alliance. Belarus does not belong to the NATO alliance. Neither does Moldova. So what you have here is Moscow's excuse for putting troops on the Ukrainian border and threatening to invade. is that they want to prevent Ukraine from becoming a NATO member. Because if Ukraine becomes a NATO member, then you have NATO troops all along the Russian border, and they don't have a buffer between Russia and Eastern European NATO countries like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and the Baltic on the Baltic countries. So that is the excuse Putin is presenting. What's really going on here is that Putin long ago has said that he hopefully this map you can see, here's Central Europe, here's Germany, here's the Czech Republic, here's Austria, you can see Italy, Netherlands, you can see all of Western Europe here, but I'm gonna close that. So you get a sense of where Ukraine is, where Russia is, why Ukraine is important to Russia. Ukraine is important to Russia because Ukraine is a barrier between NATO countries, between Eastern European countries that have aligned completely with Europeans, Western Europeans, and with NATO, and between Russia. Russia would like to believe, and Putin has said, that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He believes that Russia is a grand empire that should have massive influence, particularly over Europe and Central Asia. He wants to be able to maintain his influence over all of Eastern Europe. He would love NATO to retreat from Poland, from Slovakia, from the Czech Republic, certainly from the Baltic states, so that Putin, and Russia can reassert their own influence over that part of Europe, which he thinks justly belongs somehow to a mythical and imagined Russian empire. Russia is, in Putin's perspective, the dominant player in Eastern Europe, and should be the center of gravity for Eastern Europe. And the fact that some of these Eastern European countries, like Poland and like the Baltics, prefer the West, is an offense to Putin. Ukraine has expressed its interest in being part of the West over and over again. It did so for the first time, I think it was in 2005, in the Orange Revolution, when they overthrew and established a kind of a democratic government in Ukraine and voted in a pro-Western president. At the time, back then, there were discussions about Ukraine joining NATO. Those discussions never led to anything, and it wasn't actually achieved. After that, the president who came to power was much more aligned with the Russians, was incredibly corrupt, and in 2014, the Ukrainians in their Maidan revolution, a truly heroic, many Ukrainians lost their lives as part of this, forced the pro-Russian president to run away, to escape to Russia, replaced him with a president who was pro-West. And in a recent election, I don't know if you know this, but a comedian who played the president of Ukraine on television was elected president of Ukraine. And he is definitely very pro-West. So Ukraine has expressed through voting its interest in being a part of the West. Now, part of the complication for Ukraine is Ukraine has never developed its natural resources. Ukraine probably sits on quite a bit of natural gas, but nobody has invested in it. You'd probably need to frack. Nobody's invested in the natural resources in Ukraine. And Ukraine today is completely dependent for natural gas, for heating, for power on Russian natural gas. But more than that, an added complication of that, Russia has a pipeline that goes to Germany. Germany, of course, is dependent on natural gas from Russia. And that pipeline goes through Ukraine. So the Russians have a problem. The Russians cannot cut off Ukraine from gas without also cutting off Germany. And they don't want to cut off Germany. So they have to continue pumping gas through Ukraine and thus providing Ukraine with natural gas in the process. This is why Russia has built another pipeline And I know this is a lot of details, and many of you don't like details, but details are important. The pipeline goes from Russia to Germany through the Baltic Sea. So it doesn't have to go through Ukraine. Now, this pipeline has not been turned on, and both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have argued against it, have threatened to boycott companies that participate in the building of this pipeline, have urged the Germans not to turn it on. The Germans are eager to turn it on. They want natural gas. But what this does is that if there's a natural gas pipeline that reaches Germany directly, now Putin can cut off the natural gas from Ukraine, which creates, real challenge for Ukraine. Where does it get its energy from? It can't get its energy from the West. Of course, the solution to a lot of this is for the United States to open up for export its natural gas industry. There's some export, but we could export a lot more natural gas. We could be fracking a lot more. Part of the solution to this would be actually some investment in fracking in Ukraine, so that it could provide its own natural gas. So there's a lot that can be done that has to do with basically opening up the world market, the natural resource market, and make it possible for Ukraine and for Germany to import natural gas not from Russia, right? So to provide alternative resources for natural gas other than Russia. But Russia has basically attempted to monopolize all of Europe, in that it has become Europe's really only provider, or almost only provider, of natural gas. There are other ways to get around that. For example, Israel has vast natural gas pool in the Mediterranean. The Israelis have been pathetically slow in exploiting it, but they could start exporting that natural gas through a pipeline that they would have to build under the Mediterranean to Western Europe. That would be fantastic. The Egyptians have discovered natural gas in the Mediterranean. The Cypriots and the Turks have discovered natural gas in the Mediterranean. All of those countries could actually be pumping gas to Europe, and therefore reducing the ability of the Russians to kind of squeeze Europe for energy. So all of that is kind of the facts. Russia, of course, because it objected to the rise of politicians in Ukraine who were anti-Russian and pro-West, has continuously been putting pressure on Ukraine, including the invasion where they took Crimea and they invaded eastern Russia. You remember there was an airplane that got shot down, 300 and something people, innocent people from nowhere, just got shot down out of the sky by Russian anti-aircraft missiles. Just a horrific track record. Remember, Ukraine has to pick here, in a sense, is choosing between two things. It's choosing between an illiberal Russia, an authoritarian Russia, a Russia where basically is ruled by one man, a Russia that has no respect for freedom of speech, has no respect for freedom of movement, has no respect for economic freedoms, a Russia that is horrific, and a Europe that, we might all be critical of Europe in many respects, and certainly Europe is far from being a bastion of freedom. But relative to Russia, Europe is unbelievably free. Relative to Russia, both economically free, free in terms of freedom of speech and other freedoms. If you do not want to be a homosexual in Russia, there is sexual freedom in the West. These are all things the Ukrainians feel much more like they are Westerners than they are as Russians. They don't want to be Russian. I mean, Russian and Ukrainian as languages are very similar, and yet Ukrainians insist on speaking Ukrainian. They insist on translating books into Ukrainian. So, for example, when Atlas Shrugged came out in Ukraine, it was, as I've told you before, it was the best-selling book in Ukraine in 2015 and 16, I think. It was translated into Ukrainian, even though a Russian translation was available. So Ukrainians are very much want to be part of Europe. Russia wants Ukraine to be part of Russia. And that's the fundamental conflict. Russia is using the excuse of supposed talks about Ukraine maybe one day becoming a member of NATO. It's unlikely Ukraine ever becomes a member of NATO, and it's certainly not going to happen in the short run. Why has Putin chosen this moment to make a big deal out of this? I'd say two things. One is that he feels fairly good right now because oil prices and gas prices are fairly high. He thinks he sees the West as weak, and he thinks he can pressure the West into opening up the gas line to Germany, which I think is going to happen anyway. Because gas and oil prices are high, he has money, right? Russia is an economy completely dependent on natural resources. But on the flip side of that, Russia is a poor country. The people who live in Russia are poor. While they all claim allegiance to Putin, that could change. That could change easily. There was a lot of resentment internally over the fact that Russia is a poor country, over the fact that Europeans are significantly richer than Russians. Why now? Because I think he feels weak, and he feels like he has to rattle the cages in order to beef up his supports internally. And he thinks that the West is weak, and by rattling and warmongering, he thinks that they will cave and give into his demands. Some of his demands he knows he's not going to get, like getting NATO out of Poland, but he's hoping to at least get something in terms of Ukraine. Now, so that's, I think, Russia's perspective, Ukraine's perspective. I mean, Ukraine would love to be... Now, somebody says I'm only half right because Eastern Ukraine is pro-Russia. Very parts of Eastern Ukraine are pro-Russia. Kiev and Western Ukraine are pro the West. The overwhelming majority of the population is pro the West. About 60% of Ukrainians say they want to be part of the EU, and about 55% of them want to be part of NATO. Then there's a percentage that doesn't want either one, a pox in both their houses. It is a small minority, a relatively small minority, that wants to be part of Russia, that wants to be under the thumb of Putin, under the thumb of Russia. Most of that is in Eastern Ukraine, where the ethnic Russians dominate. So that is kind of the story of Ukraine and what's happening over there. Look, my perspective, I've said this many times, and I've said this in Russia. I think I probably shouldn't have said this in Russia, but I have said it in Russia more than once. Putin is a thug. Putin is a brutal dictator. He kills people he doesn't like. He imprisons people. There are real political prisoners in Russia. Russia is not a free country by any stretch of the imagination. Russia is also not a rich country because Putin has not allowed Russia even to be free economically. Economically, Russia has been corrupt. It's been ruled by oligarchs. It's been controlled. It lacks any semblance of freedom. And, Russia is a place, of all the places in the world, I have to say, that I have visited, I have probably disliked Russia the most. Now, maybe because it was really cold when I was there. I've been to St. Petersburg a couple of times. I've been to Moscow a couple of times. But because I don't think it's just the cold. I think it's also, there's just an oppressive nature to Russia. Of course, Ayn Rand never liked Russian culture. She liked Russian literature, but that was about it. But even the Russian literature she liked was always dark. There's a darkness to Russia. There's a darkness to the culture. There's a fear, and there's an authoritarian nature to Russian culture. And there's a mysticism to Russian culture, which Ayn Rand very much objected to. The thing that she didn't like about Russian culture was its mysticism. So I'm no fan of Russia, and I'm certainly no fan of Putin. I think it's sad that there was an opportunity, a window of opportunity in the 1990s for Russia to become, free and to become capitalist and become wealthy and to become successful. And to a large extent, that was blown partially because of the incompetence and just the ignorance and stupidity of the Russian authorities, but also because of the advice the Russians were getting from American academics. American academics came there and said, oh, the way to achieve freedom is to give everybody stocks and to privatize. And there was no thought given to the institutions necessary, to property rights, to a police force, to security. And what happens is that the privatization, instead of truly privatizing Russian businesses and truly engage in economic freedom for the people, what happened was that people who were willing to use physical force, people who were willing to create their own mafias, their own organized crime syndicates, basically gained control through physical force to a large extent over all the entities that were being privatized. And those are the famous oligarchs of Russia. And they controlled, and Russia became this unbelievably violent place. Life expectancy plummeted. And life expectancy plummeted, wealth plummeted from the lows of the Soviet Union. It plummeted even further. And this was Yeltsin, under Yeltsin, but Yeltsin was just incompetent. I think he had the right intentions, good intentions, but he was just incompetent. And as a consequence of that, what the Russians longed for, given the anarchy, given the force, given the violence, not violence of the state, but violence from these mafia-like entities, what the Russians ultimately longed for was a strong man who could just stop the violence, give them some peace, stop the decay, stop the huge rise in alcoholism, the huge rise in death, the decline in quality of life, standard of living, and life expectancy. And that was Putin. Putin came to power to clean up the mess. Initially, he was influenced by good people. There is good reason to believe that Putin had, probably not anymore, but had Atlas Shrugged on his bookshelf in his office at the Kremlin. One of his chief advisors initially in the early part of Putin's rule was a man who was a huge Ayn Rand fan, a free market guy, and who tried to advise Putin to move in that direction, rule of law, free markets, contracts. Imagine what would have happened to Russia, what Russia could have achieved if it had done that. Instead, that guy, and I apologize for forgetting his name, but I think he now works for the Cato Institute, had to leave Russia, and basically declare that Putin was anti-markets, anti-freedom, anti-liberty. And he moved to Cato and still writes about Russia from the Cato Institute. And he tells, so there was significant opportunity for people influenced by Ayn Rand, influenced by Atlas Shrugged, at the highest levels of Russian government, to try to influence Putin in a positive direction. And that all blew up, that all went away because of, Putin's desire to be an authoritarian and his basic interest in accumulating all the wealth for himself. I mean, Putin is supposedly one of the richest men in the world. Secret bank accounts in Switzerland and elsewhere, all stolen from the Russian state, right? He hasn't produced anything. Not exactly a businessman. So, I think here Russia is clearly in the wrong. It is trying to, if Ukraine, a sovereign nation, wants to join a military alliance, it's none of Russia's business. If Ukraine, a sovereign nation, wants to affiliate itself economically with the West, it's none of Russia's business. But Russia is making its business because Russia believes that NATO is a threat to it. Russia wants an empire. Russia wants to control what happens in Eastern Europe. And Russia clearly, let's be very, very, very clear here. Russia here is in the wrong. Putin is a thug. Ukraine is in the right. Ukraine's sovereignty should be respected. Russia has no legitimate excuse to invade Ukraine. None, right? All right, now let's shift to the United States. What interest does the United States have in Ukraine? None. I mean, philosophically, ideologically, obviously, the United States has an interest in freedom and liberty in the world, right? It has an interest in standing up, if you will, or in restraining authoritarians, and in allowing for freedom and liberty. Ukraine is a relatively free country. Russia is an authoritarian country. It would be preferable for the United States if Ukraine stayed independent. It would be preferable for the United States if Putin was deposed and a free country was established in Russia. A lot of things would be preferable for the United States. The question is, does that preference justify the United States being involved in any way in Ukraine, but specifically militarily? Does it justify the United States going to defend Ukraine? And the answer for that is no. And the reason for that is that the job of the United States government is to protect the individual rights of Americans. The individual rights of Americans are not threatened by Russia, sorry. Russia could take Ukraine, Russia could then take Poland, Russia could take Germany. And the individual rights of Americans are not threatened by that. It might not be good. It might reduce trade, it might reduce wealth in the world, it might not be ideal. But how many of your sons are you willing to sacrifice for the sake of the Germans and the Ukrainians? Now, I find it interesting, right? Germany is a far richer country than Russia. Germany can mount a military force that should be able to withstand anything Russia has. Of course, Germany, NATO, even if the United States was not a member of it, should be able to take the Russians on and defeat them. Europe has a larger population than Russia. It is significantly richer than Russia. It has far superior technology than Russia. It can buy that technology from the United States. I have no problem with the United States selling arms, selling weapons to Ukraine, to the rest of Europe, to any country that is fighting generally for freedom should be able to buy weapons from the United States to defend itself. It's a travesty that the United States has not sold Ukraine more. Yes, Russia has nukes, but Russia's unlikely to use nukes. And by the way, so does NATO, even without the US, right? The Brits have nukes, the French have nukes. So Germany, I think, has a strong interest in preventing the Russians from taking Ukraine. It just brings the Russians closer to the German border. Poland, other countries in Europe have a strong interest in preventing the Russians from taking Ukraine. Now, Germany is not willing to fight the Russians. Germany is not willing to commit to doing anything about the Russians. Germany wants its natural gas from Russia. So why is the United States in the middle of this? Because of our role in NATO and because of the idea that we are somehow the defender of every free country in the world, that we're somehow the policeman of the world. They're supposed to go after every thug that's out there in the world. I mean, it's very difficult to do right now, but the United States should stand down. We just put 8,500 troops on alert all over Europe. For what? Are we going to send them into Kiev? Are we going to bomb Russia? What exactly are they alert for? It's just saber rattling. It's just pretense. The United States does not need another war in Europe. It does not need to police Europe. Again, Europe is wealthy. Europe is militarily far superior to Russia if it invested the money in it. So it's time for the Europeans to stop free riding off of America. It's time for the Europeans to take care of their own affairs. It's time for the Europeans to become independent of the United States of America. Now, I know people say, yeah, but when they did, Germany, Nazis, First World War One. Okay, but, if the Europeans want to slaughter each other, it's not the job of America to stop them. I think that one of the most horrific decisions ever made by an American president is joining World War One. And I think Ayn Rand was right in not wanting to go into World War II until Pearl Harbor, when we had no choice. Trump didn't quite get it right because Trump wanted them to pay more, but he still wanted to be in NATO. I'm saying the United States should not be in NATO. The United States should leave NATO, should have a transition plan. Maybe it takes 5 years, maybe it takes 10 years, in which NATO becomes an independent entity free of the United States, raises its own money. I would encourage the United States I would suggest that the United States encourage, for example, Asian countries that do not want to fall under the thumb of China to establish treaties among them. So you can imagine if South Koreans and Japanese could get over the animosity between them establishing an alliance, maybe with other countries in South Asia, all the way to India. India has a strong interest to control China. It has a disputed border with China. But the United States has no border with China. The United States has no border with Russia. The United States should, from a militarily perspective, leave these countries alone. Now, if China intervenes in shipping to the United States, if Russia stops U.S. boats out there, if they disrupt our shipping lanes, if they do stuff that makes it impossible for free countries to trade, for example, then the United States should intervene. But other than that, the United States should not be putting its military in alert. We should not be sending more troops. Indeed, we should be bringing troops home. Now, I feel bad saying that because I don't want any of that to embolden Putin. That's why I started off by emphasizing how anti-Putin I am and how anti-Russia I am. I'm pro-Ukraine. I'm pro-Ukrainian independence. I hope the Ukrainians crush the Russians if there's a war. I would supply the Ukrainians with all the weapons they can have, they can use. Let the Ukrainians defend themselves. Look, Israel, a tiny little country, defends itself against hundreds of millions of Muslims. Let the Ukrainians defend themselves against Russia. I think Russia could be in for a nasty surprise when they invade Ukraine, particularly in the winter. And if the Ukrainians are armed, if the Ukrainians have the technology, then in spite of the fact that Russia has nukes and Ukraine doesn't, they should be able to defend themselves or inflict a lot of casualties on the Russians, which would hurt Putin, make Putin's position domestically in Russia very, very tenable. The Russians don't want a war. I mean, they want a war for nationalistic reasons. What they don't want is their kids dying. 40% of Ukraine is ethnically Russian. So what? But they're part of Ukraine. It's a different country. Does Mexico have a right to invade because we have a lot of Mexicans living in the United States? I mean, it's just pathetic. But there are people out there. There's a segment of the libertarian movement, Ron Paul being part of it, and there's a segment of the conservative movement that love Vladimir Putin, that love Russia, or you could flip that hate the United States, and as a consequence will justify anything Putin does, justify his taking of Crimea. Ukraine is a sovereign state. It's a free country. Nobody has a right to invade it, even if they're ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So what? Countries are not just ethnic groups. The USSR was a travesty. Nothing should be recognized from the USSR days. But anyway, right now it's a country. Leave it alone. How far back in history do we have to go? Lithuania, used to occupy Poland. Should Lithuania just invade Poland and say, hey, once upon a time, you were part of us? Maybe we should go back to the Holy Roman Empire. Anyway, I mean, it's ridiculous to use history. Oh, but the Russians had this a long time ago. So what? They don't anymore. Keep their hands off. It's a free country. The way you measure these things is who's free and who's not. Russia is the illegitimate regime. Russia is the regime that should go away. It's legitimate to invade Russia because it's unfree. It's illegitimate to invade Ukraine, which is a relatively free country. Soviet Union doesn't count, guys. Soviet Union was a dictatorship, communist dictatorship. No, nothing from the Soviet Union in terms of borders counts. The Soviet Union should have been defeated. We should never, ever, ever use anything from the Soviet Union as a standard for anything today. Yeah, I don't. Anyways, so Russia's not more free than the U.S. in any respect, any respect. But yes, as I said, there are people in the chat who are rah Russia. As I said, they're probably big supporters of Ron Paul, would be my guess. But yes, there's a whole segment of the libertarian movement that is very, very, very pro-Russia. It's amazing to me. It's like there's a huge segment of the conservative movement that is very pro-Orban. Whoops, there goes my light. Let me just fix that. So Orban and Putin are kind of favorites. And even though these people tend to be nationalists, all nationalisms are okay except Ukrainian nationalism. Ugh. Yeah, I'm repeating State Department talking points, and I'm the statist. I love the chat. You know, the people that come up with these strange points of view that they get spoon fed by people like Ron Paul. This is why I hate Ron Paul. By Ron Paul or by the conservative nationalists or by, you know, whatever flavor of the week there is of something out there. Is just unbelievable. Just unbelievable. All right. Anyway, the United States should not intervene in Ukraine. Ukraine should crush any Soviet invasion. And I would support if the Russians invade Ukraine, I completely support the Ukrainians in their efforts to take Moscow. I'd like to see the Ukrainians occupy Russia. I think that would be cool. All right. Let's see. Remind everybody, Super Chat is open. We have some questions, not a lot. We've raised some money, not as much as we need. I have no idea. Maybe I can get an update here of how much where we are, so I can encourage people to get us to the 600 that we need. Let's see. I'm gonna look quickly at the questions, see which ones are related. No. Tom Schubadam says, didn't Germany shut down a bunch of nuclear power plants? Yes, they did. Doesn't this affect its dependence on Russian energy? Yes, but even with the nuclear power plants, Germany was heavily dependent on Russian natural gas. The fact that it shut down the nuclear power plants has made it also dependent on Polish coal in order to fuel its coal plants, which they had to reopen because they shut down the nuclear plants. Just unbelievable. And this is from people who claim to be anti-coal. All right, we'll talk about that in a minute. What were your thoughts on the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine 2014 when they armed and trained neo-Nazis to overthrow the democratically elected government? Wow, that's a loaded question, isn't it? Lots of stuff in there that is questionable. I completely support the coup in Ukraine in 2014. It was a people's rebellion. It was not a rebellion of neo Nazis. Now, I'm not saying neo Nazis didn't on occasion participate, but the core of the coup, I've met people who participated in that coup. I met some of the leaders of the student rebellion, people who slept in tents outside the Maidan in the center of Kiev. I completely support the coup. You had a corrupt authoritarian president, and who was becoming more and more oppressive. It was becoming clearer and clearer that he was you being, I guess, Base Clay was trying to be making fun of the kind of standard what is it, Russian talking points. So that was just a list of talking points. But I'm going to take it seriously because there are people out there who believe this stuff. The coup in 2014 was a heroic achievement. Again, I knew and met a lot of the people who participated in it. Ukraine generally is a wonderful place. I've told you the people there read Atlas Shrugged and loved it. They want liberty. They want their freedom. They're stuck in a part of the world that is very difficult between a pretty very, very poor southeastern Europe and between an oppressive Russia and a history of lack of freedom, a history, they survived the Soviet Union. Ukraine did. They were part of the Soviet Union. And it's very difficult for them. And they in 2014 established a relatively free government. And what's happened since then is that Russia has just tried by any means possible to chip away and chip away and chip away and try to take more and more and more control over Ukraine and to deny them the little bit of freedom that they have. Right. Yeah, so basically claims that I am a hack, right? Right. So anyway, um, I know very few people out there who know foreign policy better than I do. So, but as I said, all the crazies and nuts, from libertarians to national conservatives to Trumpists, come out and want to play when it comes to Russia, and wait until I do my show about Orban, which I've promised and continue to do. Travis, thank you for the support. Really appreciate it. But yeah, as I said, 2014 was, I'm all pro the 2014 so-called coup that kicked out a corrupt regime and replaced it with a much better regime. Not perfect. Ukrainian politics is very corrupt. Catherine, what are we up to? Where are we? Where are we? Yeah, I know. I'm accused constantly of being mainstream because I report things when I agree with the mainstream that are mainstream, and people ignore my disagreements with the mainstream, like leaving NATO and stuff like that. That's not convenient for them. So I'm just a tool of the mainstream media. I'm just a tool of the State Department. I'm just a tool of NATO, of the Biden administration. I don't know, something like that. But that's because people have no ability to be nuanced. You're either pro using force in Ukraine to stop the Russians, or you're pro-Russian. There's no other alternative. You can't be anything but that. Yeah, basically the two people you mentioned as foreign policy writers are hacks. I said that before, and I repeat it. All right, we're $241, so we're still $360 short, and so on. I'm a clown, yet here you are, listening and actually contributed $20 to my clownship. That's great. Thank you. Let's see. James has a question. Russia, does it make sense for Russia to attack Ukraine and China to attack Taiwan at the same time? It appears they're working together on a similar agenda. No, I don't think so. I think these are two completely different cases. China attacking Taiwan is going to be very difficult. Taiwan has a much stronger military, is a much richer country, is a much more difficult country to invade. China has to really worry about the United States. The United States has on occasion mentioned that it is more committed to defending Taiwan. I don't think it would, but China has to be careful. China also has to be careful domestically to do it right and to win quickly. And I don't think it's possible. The Taiwanese now have been trained in guerrilla warfare. They have advanced weapons system. They have advanced fighters. They have a fairly good navy. It would be difficult for China to invade. And of course, they don't have to do it simultaneously because it's not like the U.S. is going to do anything. It's not like the U.S. is going to defend Ukraine. So it's not really a distraction. It's a distraction mentally, but it's not a military distraction. The United States could decide to defend Taiwan and not to defend Ukraine. So China has to step very cautiously here. It does not want a war with the United States. And the other thing that China doesn't want, and this is the thing that's preventing it from invading Taiwan, the last thing China wants is an embargo where the United States, just stops dealing with China, just stops buying stuff from China. China is integrated into the world economy. China depends on the world economy. It has to sell stuff to the world economy. Its economy would collapse if we stop buying Chinese stuff, if the Europeans stop buying Chinese stuff. And if it invades Taiwan, then there is a 90% chance that the globe, the free countries, the wealthy countries, China's customers would stop buying Chinese stuff. And if that happened, the Chinese economy would collapse. And then Xi is in big trouble and Xi would be kicked out. So no, I think the two are completely different. I think Russia knows that Russia doesn't sell much to the West. It sells energy. Other than that, it doesn't sell anything to the West. Russia is not an export-led economy other than energy. Russia knows that Europe has to buy energy from them. But look, I don't think Russia wants to invade Ukraine because I think it's a real challenge for them. Now, China is going to collapse ultimately anyway, but it won't invade Taiwan until it's desperate, and it's not desperate yet. And China's not going to do this in order to give cover to Russia. It doesn't care about Russia enough. They're coordinating, not because they like each other, they're coordinating because they sense American weakness. And they are the two powers in the world outside of the United States. So no, I don't expect China to invade Taiwan anytime soon. Dean asks, in your view, when is it okay for the USA to participate in a war when it itself is not at risk? What if an ally of the US like Israel is at risk of losing a war? What about just air support? No, I don't think the United States should participate in a war, period. Even of an ally. Americans shouldn't die so Israel should exist. What am all my haters going to do with that line? Right? I'm usually called a Zionist who wants to sell out the United States for the sake of whatever. So, no, I don't think the United States should go to war unless the enemy that attacks country X is likely to attack the United States next. So, let's say China or Russia invaded Mexico. Now those countries have a border with the United States, and it becomes a war that the United States should be involved in. Defending Mexico makes sense. Defending Israel does not. It's just not a crucial interest of the United States. Wolf then says, just because I think you're a bit nutty with State Department talking points, you see, they can't nuance. They can't think about nuances. It's either one or two. I told you this I've talked about this many times. People can only think in terms of twos. They can't think in terms of threes, right? And so you're either, you're either anti-democrat, you're either pro-democrat or pro-Trump. You can't be anti-democrat and anti-Trump as well. You're either pro-Russia or you want America to intervene in Ukraine, which is you're just a tool of the State Department. It's truly stunning, the inability to see any kind of nuance, any kind of argument, any kind of, I've purposefully here layered the facts, layered the arguments, and presented my case. But I have a certain view of American foreign policy that is so outside of their imagination. They're so pro-Russian. That is. All right, just because I think you're a bit nutty with State Department talking points, this is $25 he's given me for this, to call me a nut about Ukraine. Doesn't mean I don't support you, your show, or your overall goals. Keep up the good work. You should try to get into RT's crosstalk. I've been on RT. I don't really, yeah. Thank you for the support. I appreciate that, even though I think you're completely wrong on foreign policy. How would you describe a healthy relationship with allies, especially ones that don't share a border? I mean, I think the main thing that allies do is they trade freely with one another. They supply each other with weapons, intelligence. They support themselves in that way. But it doesn't mean you die for one another. It doesn't mean you die for one another. You don't put your troops in danger. So the United States was an ally of Great Britain during World War II, and maybe during World War I. Doesn't mean it had to go and send troops to die for Great Britain. But it certainly sent weapons. It diplomatically supported, moral support is really, really important. Military support. It could have encouraged its own citizens to volunteer and go and fight for the ally, or, you could do things like that. But to send the military on any mission that does not involve the direct protection of the individual rights of Americans is, I think, a violation of the responsibility of a government. Jeffrey Miller says, values and ideas are the antidote to binary thinking. Yes, but you have to have values and you have to be willing to think. So I think thinking is the antidote to binary thinking, because binary thinking, of course, is not thinking. So Jeffrey also asked the question about healthy relationship. Again, I think it's a shared values. It's open trade. It's diplomatic relations. It's sharing technology, military technology, sharing weapons, and all of that. It's not. I mean, the key is it's not dying for one another. I hope nobody here actually gets their news from RT TV. Talk about a mouthpiece. RT TV is the mouthpiece of Putin. If the United States thinks long-term, shouldn't they protect a free, rational country? Why is the self-sacrifice of its United States self-interest that the allies survive long-term? It is in America's self-interest that its allies survive long-term. Foreign policy is not about interests. It's not, it's absolutely. But what is the role of government? The role of government is one and one only, not to protect our interests. It's not to protect our interests. It's not to make the world a better place to live. It's not to make the world a safer place to live. The role of government is to protect the individual rights of Americans. And if those individual rights are not threatened, then the United States does not send people to fight and die. Does not take your hard-earned money and spend it that. Now, I could ask you as an individual this question, Dean. If you're an American, as an American individual, you think that it's in your rational self-interest for free countries like Israel to survive and thrive. Yes. Does that mean you go and volunteer when Israel is invaded by foreign armies? No. Not everything that's in your interest requires you to put your life at stake in order to protect that interest. Some things do. You know, somebody's attacking your wife and kids, but some things don't. And you might send money to Israel. You might morally support Israel. But are you willing to go fight for Israel because it's in your long-term interest that Israel survive? And the same thing is true of America. It's in America's long-term interest that Ukraine stay independent. Absolutely true. Should we sacrifice our sons and daughters for that interest? No. It's not a big enough interest. Scott says, you said Hitler was only a threat to Europe and not the United States after invading Poland, but wasn't he a threat to the U.S. if he wanted to take over the world? If you thought it was viable that he could pose a threat to the United States, then yes. So I think once the United States had a sense that he was developing missiles that could reach the United States, once he started attacking non-military shipping across the Atlantic, yes, I think at some point it was inevitable for the United States to intervene in the war. But you cannot intervene in that war until it becomes evident that that threat is real and he has the capability of executing in that threat. Ayn Rand argued that if we'd left that war alone, that the Russians and the Nazis would have fought each other to exhaustion, and that there would be nothing left of either the Soviets or the Nazis to fight the United States. Her claim was we should have never supported the Soviet Union, but we should have just let Hitler occupy Moscow. How well was that going to turn out for him? And that because of his authoritarian nature, the technology he developed would never have advanced, and he would have, in the end, collapsed from within and would have never posed a threat to the United States. That was her argument. I'm not an expert on World War II, but I tend to agree with Ayn Rand. Right? He was so delusional he thought he could take over Europe. He couldn't even succeed at doing that. Never mind taking over the world. He would have never succeeded. Corey says, could you elaborate on the military support you referred to earlier, as opposed to moral and private financial support? If you oppose America fighting and dying for others' freedom, what would military support consist of? It means selling weapons. So it doesn't mean giving them away, because it's not the government's to give. It means, so in a free society, there would be weapons manufacturers who would manufacture sophisticated weapons, tanks, missiles, bombs, all kinds of stuff. And in the United States, the customer of those companies would be the United States military. In order for those companies to sell weapons outside of the United States, they would have to get the government's permission. And I know the libertarians among you are flipping out, but they would have to get the government's permission. And I would say that what I mean by military support is that all free countries would be on a list that says American produced military equipment can be sold to them. So, for example, Saudi Arabia would not be on that list. I would not be selling Saudi Arabia F-15s and F-22s or whatever we're selling in the Saudis. But Ukraine would be on the list. Israel would be on the list. Europe, all of Europe would be on the list. South Korea would be on the list. Japan would be on the list. China would not be. Russia would not be. Saudi Arabia would not be. North Korea would not be. And all I mean by military support is that a willingness to sell them weapons. right, that's an off topic. Off topic. That one I answered already. All right, we're getting some thoughts on Germany's decision to block transfer of military arms from the Baltics to Ukraine. I think Germany's wrong. I think that the Baltic states, I think that the United States should be able to sell weapons to Ukraine, and I think it's in Russia's long-term self-interest to allow for those weapons to get there. I think Germany is afraid of conflict with Russia, and this is exactly what Russia has striven to achieve, and that is to have Germany by the throat. And of course, it's winter. Germany needs that natural gas, otherwise its people will freeze this winter, given that it shut down its nuclear power plants. Let's see. Stephen from New Zealand. Wow. Thank you, Stephen. I can understand why you don't want the U.S. to defend Ukraine, but shouldn't all Western countries, including my country, New Zealand, defend Ukraine to ensure that a freedom-loving country does not fall to Russian tyranny? I mean, this is the question. I don't know if you have any kids, Stephen, but imagine if you did and you had a son. Would you be willing to look your son in the eye when they were 18 and say, I want you to go to Ukraine and fight for freedom? I wouldn't. It's not enough of a direct interest. Yes, I want Ukraine not to fall for Russian tyranny. And some people might be so passionate about that they'd be willing to go and volunteer for the Ukrainian military and go fight for Ukraine. Good for them. But Ukrainian freedom is not important enough to me for me to risk my own life and for me to risk my child's life. And if I'm not willing to risk my life or my child's life, how can I risk other people's children's lives? War is not free. It was free, sure, but it's not free. And the New Zealand's government's responsibility is to protect New Zealand, not Ukraine. And again, it could support Ukraine morally. It could encourage its citizens to send money to Ukraine. It could allow its citizens to go and volunteer and fight for Ukraine. But it cannot send its own military forces that I think are sworn to protect only New Zealand, not to prevent freedom around the world. Who gets to decide when all these free countries go to war? For example, Germany doesn't want to go to war. Should all the countries that want to go to war and exclude the others? I still don't see how it's right to send your kids to go fight for them. I want the whole world to be free. But I also know that ultimately the whole world to be free is going to require ideas, and it's going to require the suppression of these oppressive regimes. But the only way to long-term put down the Russians is to defeat them ideologically. So no, while we all have an interest, we're all freedom-loving, I'm only going to risk my life and my property to protect my freedom directly, which means my country. And that doesn't mean I don't care. It doesn't mean I don't support the Ukrainians. It doesn't mean I wouldn't support sending them help to the extent that I can. But it's just you have to think about the fact that your government, as a government official, you're responsible for the individual rights of the soldiers as well. Now they did volunteer, but they volunteered for something. They volunteered to protect their country, not to bring democracy to the world and not protect free countries everywhere in the world. So that's my view. Let me put it this way. I'm much more sympathetic to people who think we should fight Russia than people who think Russia should just have Ukraine and, hey, I'm cool with Russia. Because I'm anti-Russia fundamentally. I just don't think that it's appropriate for a government to send its troops half the way around the world to fight for somebody else's freedom. Scott says, this is the most glaring example so far of Germany's pathetic energy policy. Germany is impotent to any proper action for fear of freezing if the wind stops. It would be good to see Alex Epstein to tackle this. I agree, because Germany, I think, has a real interest in stopping Russia. Germany should be willing to go to war with Russia to stop them invading Ukraine. Because Germany is right there. Russia has a direct impact on Germany. Russia could invade Germany easily. So Russia has a direct existential interest in Ukraine being free and not being taken over by the Russians. And yet, Germany is impotent for two reasons. One, because it's committed to not having a powerful military because of its history. And two, because it's dependent on Russia for energy, which is pathetic. All right, we are at $444, so we are short $156 to get our $600 goal. So if there are people out there who are willing to jump in and support the show and support my efforts to bring a nuanced view of good versus evil to the world, and to fight for liberty and freedom, then please support the show. We're looking for basically $150 right now. In support. All right, let's see. Do you see any parallels in how Russia, China, New York, California, and Illinois are run by government? Do you think some states have policy like them? I think it's very dangerous to make these kind of comparisons, because I think they're wrong. Russia and China are ruled by dictators. Like it or not, New York, California, and Illinois are ruled by democratically elected leaders. That means that for the most part, Russia and China, the people have no say in who and what happens to them. New York, California, and Illinois, the people have lots of say, and this is what they want. They have chosen these policies. They want these policies. New York, California, Illinois can change course. They can go in a different direction. I'd also say that in New York, California, and Illinois, for the most part, still, your rights, some of your rights are protected. There are contracts that are protected. The property rights, to some extent, are protected. Freedom of speech is protected. Now, not as much as any of us would want, not even close to the way any of us would want. But they are protected. In China and Russia, they're not. The Chinese and Russian regimes can do whatever the hell they want, anytime, to whomever they want. It's not true in America yet. Even in California and Illinois and New York. So I think it's a huge mistake to associate bad policies of basically free countries with the policies of basically unfree countries. Applejack815, thank you for the support. Really appreciate it. Let's see, what else do we have here? Michael says, it seems like Washington was right in warning the United States to stay out of European problems. Absolutely. Many U.S. lives would be spared if the warning would be taken seriously. Yes, particularly World War I. And if you wouldn't have had American involvement in World War I, it's doubtful whether we'd had World War II, or certainly the kind of World War we had in World War II. So President Wilson is my least favorite president, and one big reason for that, other than the income tax and the Federal Reserve, is the fact that he got the United States into World War I. To me, that's one of the most horrific decisions the American president has ever made. Let's see. Andrew says, you may have said this too, but it rang true when a TV analyst said Putin is invading Ukraine because of U.S. weakness over Afghanistan. How do you explain that philosophically? Evil gains confidence when good lacks it. Yes, but look, Putin invaded Ukraine, I forget the year, but before Afghanistan, the United States has been weak forever. Putin wasn't just waiting for this. It's certainly American weakness, but we think America was strong under Trump, or we think America was strong under Obama. No, America's been weak for a couple of decades. And the Russians keep testing, they keep pushing. Putin keeps pushing and testing and seeing how far he can get. And I think what motivates him more than anything else is not just American weakness. That certainly is one motivation. But another is internal pressures. And I'm not enough of a Russia expert to tell you what those internal pressures are right now, but I bet you there are domestic reasons why Putin is doing this. And look, when the good is silent. And the other thing Putin wanted is he wanted to be able to get gas to Germany without Ukraine. And now he has that pipeline. And now he has Europe by the balls. And that's why he's doing it now. So I think we underestimate to the extent to which, or we don't estimate appropriately, the extent to which Putin and other thugs around the world have viewed the United States as weak for a long time. It's not new. Corey says, thank you for what you do. Your insights into issues are always refreshing and sometimes surprising in a good way, and kicks my mind into gear and helps me rethink some of my own conclusions. Obviously, I'm still learning, and having you is a huge help. Thank you. I mean, we're all still learning. There's always stuff to learn. So thank you, Corey. I really appreciate your support now and over the last couple of years. It's really, really appreciated. Dean says, it's amazing how you stick to principles and never falling into pragmatism, even in front of hard questions. Always a pleasure to see your show. Thank you, Dean. Really appreciate it, and thank you for the support all the way from Israel. The shekels just flow in. Let's see. Nobody's invading Ukraine anyway. Dave says, post-enlightenment, evil always seems to fizzle out. This fact gives me hope for the future of humanity. Me too, and why war is not always the solution. The best way is just to leave them alone. The Soviet Union went away without us fighting a war with them, and indeed the proxy wars we fought with them, we lost a lot of blood and a lot of treasure, like Vietnam, and those weren't why the Soviet Union fell in the end. I mean, if we hate Putin so much that we want to fight him, why do we need Ukraine? Just take out Putin. It's not what I'm advocating for, but proxy wars are always a disaster. Pragmatism is never valuable. Practicality is valuable. Pragmatism is never valuable. Pragmatism means short-term, unprincipled thinking. That's only leads to disaster. All right, let's see. It's Dave Scott. That's off subject. I answered that one. Oh, Yasser asks, is it in the EU's interests to accept Ukraine as a member? I don't think Ukraine overall really want freedom. I don't know about Ukraine's overall. I don't know what that means. A significant number of Ukrainians want freedom. I think there are people in Western Ukraine that wouldn't mind being annexed by Western Europe. The students I met, and I met many of them in Kiev, want freedom. They don't want Russia. They don't want to be oppressed by the Russians. They don't want a war with Russia, and they don't want to be ruled by Russia. They don't want Putin as their dictator. Ukraine is not to Russia like Mexico is to the United States, because the United States doesn't try to run Mexico. It doesn't try to replace, the Mexican president. Mexico often turns its back to the United States. The current president of Mexico hates the United States. We are not, in spite of my hatred of Washington, D.C., we are not Russia. We are not Putin. Putin is a bad guy. He is a thug. He is a bad influence. He is an authoritarian. The United States is not vis-a-vis Mexico, not vis-a-vis Canada. So, all right. It's unbelievable to me how people take somebody like Putin and compare him even to our pathetic system. It's much, much worse. sorry, some of you guys have no clue. No clue about the world and about foreign policy. Tazy, is that right? Tazy? Tazy. Daisy rhymes with Daisy. Tazy, thank you. Really appreciate it. I think that the EU has a self-interest to accept Ukraine as a member. You know, it's a question of, what does the EU want? If the EU wants a trading bloc, then the bigger the better. If it wants a political bloc that is generally pro-freedom, invite Ukraine in, absolutely. If it wants a trading bloc, invite Ukraine in. So I don't see what the downside of having Ukraine as a member of the EU is. I don't, as I said, I think the United States should get out of NATO. But the Europeans have a strong interest in not having Russia take over Ukraine. Samuel asks, if you were Ukrainian, would it be be rational to enlist in a war with Russia or flee to another country? And should the U.S. let many Ukrainians in? Oh, wow. I mean, that's really difficult to say, right? Do you love the place you live? To what extent do you love your relatives? What's your estimation on your ability to win if you enlist in a war with Russia? Is it a suicide mission? Are you protecting something of value to you, like your family? Is your country of value to you? I would probably leave because I don't know that Ukraine is, for me, worth fighting for, right? But I can understand why people enlist. And should the U.S. let many Ukrainians in? Absolutely. But I think the U.S. should let many people from many places in the world in. I think we should let Chinese in. I think we should let Hong Kong, all of Hong Kong in. I think we should generally let people in. I think there's way too few people in the U.S. So Ukrainians, absolutely. Why not? Right? Anybody, but I don't think we should pay for them to come, and I don't think they should get welfare. I think they should come in if they can get a job. So I think if your family is a high value, if you like living in Ukraine and you get great value from living in Ukraine, and you have a lot of values in Ukraine, maybe you have a girlfriend in Ukraine, maybe you have children in Ukraine, I don't know, then you got to fight for the values you believe in. Then you enlist and you fight. All right, James G. writes, showing support for one individual to another, you really helped me see opportunity, how to maximize value in moving to a new area. I think you really show that the biggest obstacle to people is their own belief system. I think that's absolutely right. Thank you, James. I really appreciate the support. Ali, I submitted an interview sponsor. I haven't heard back yet. Where did you submit it? I'm not sure where you submitted, Ali. And who is it? Who are you sponsoring for me to interview? Did you send it to Yaron at YaronBookShow.com? Because I don't think I've seen it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I've seen it. All right, where are you? Where are we? Ashton writes, thank you for $50. Thank you, Ashton. That's very generous. Really appreciate it. We're only like $14 away from $600. So thank you, everybody who's contributed. And we did it without, I don't think anybody contributing $100. So we did it with a lot of kind of 25s, $50, things like that. So that's terrific. Thanks, everybody. Ashton says, why did Ayn Rand talk highly? Okay, so this is off topic. I guess we're all off topic now. Why did Ayn Rand talk highly of the Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas when she herself despised religion for its irrationality? Because Thomas Aquinas brought reason into the Christian church, and by doing so, resurrected the importance of reason, brought forward the importance of reason into Western civilization. Reason, to a large extent, proper reason, Aristotelian reason, was dead in the West. It had been replaced by faith and by Platonism and by all kinds of mystical elements, and divorced from reality. And what Aquinas did is he reintroduced Aristotle, Aristotelian logic, Aristotelian reason, into the West. And by doing so, made it possible for the Renaissance to happen, and ultimately for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, the creation of America, and everything good that's happened since, is a consequence of the reintroduction of reason into the West, the rediscovery of Aristotle. And that Thomas Aquinas did. So in spite of his religiosity, in spite of his real religiosity, she respected his willingness to take on, it wasn't just reason as an abstraction. He was willing to take on the idea of worldly happiness. Again, taken from Aristotle, the idea the purpose of life is to be happy. He was willing to take on secular ideas, non-Platonic secular ideas, attached to reality, connected to this world. And that knowledge was achieved through reason. And he had to rationalize his whole religiosity part. But the core of his ideas was this positive, right? All right. Let's see. Colt says, no question today. Just wanted to say thank you for all your insights on this issue. My friend, who is from Ukraine, is watching the show now, and she also appreciates your insight. It's so refreshing to hear. Yeah, and again, I've had, when I visited Ukraine, I've really had a good time, and I really value that. All right, let's see. What do we have here? Him says, ever think about having some of us as guests to chat with an old master and learn a few things? What would lead me to believe that you are an old master in anything? I just don't know. And no, I mean, given what I've seen of the comments, you don't strike me as somebody I'd be interested in interviewing. But I don't know why you would think I would think you were an old master. Old master at what? Thank you for the $10, by the way. Let's see. Wolf's Den 3. Thank you for letting me talk shit, even though you are a bit off as an employee of the State Department with Ukraine issue. I still like you and your show. Laugh out loud. Yeah, I get a check weekly from the State Department as one of their tools of propaganda. Why is this not letting me copy? Okay, got it. Let's see. I like that they at least these guys, when they talk shit, actually putting some dollars behind the shit is pretty amazing. All right, we'll get to that. So all right, this is somewhat related. Post-COVID, I might not fight for Australia. I'm with you. God is what Australia has done. I think Australians should leave Australia. I would leave if there was a war. Could you talk about your thoughts in regard to exit, voice, and loyalty? I'm not sure what exit, voice, and loyalty is, but I'm not big on loyalty, not to the state. A lot of tech people are talking about exit now. It's a new concept to me. Absolutely. I mean, look, I exited. I left Israel after being in the military, after fighting in a war. I left Israel because, look, this is the principle as an individual. The principle as an individual is you only have one life. You have a finite amount of time. Why waste it on living in a place that's not the best that you can achieve? So if you can live a better life in New Zealand, or if you can live a better life in America, if you can live a better life in Canada, why are you staying in Australia? What is it that keeps you there? So what you have to do is make an assessment of the values. I left Israel knowing that I wouldn't see my family as often. I wouldn't, and it wouldn't be close to the neighborhood where I grew up. I wouldn't, all the emotional links that are to a place and all of that. But I wanted to live the best life that I could live. I wanted to express myself the best of my ability. I wanted to live in a place where I could maximize my potential. And I knew that that was not Israel, that was America. So I left. And I think that each one of you needs to think about that. And it might come a time where America is not the best place in the world to live. We might be there already, I don't know. And you need to think at every point in your life, where's the place in the world where I can live the best damn life that I can live? Where I can make the most of myself, most of the potential that I have, and achieve the greatest happiness. You should not be loyal to a geography. You should not be loyal to a place. Emilio says, thanks for the analysis, keep it up. Do you have any idea what Putin's intention are in Latin America? He already has troops in Cuba and Venezuela. I mean, his intentions are to destabilize the United States. Putin has an interest in weakening the United States and destabilizing it. Once and Emilio, I get to that. Ali says he did it on the website. Ali, don't do it on the website. Send me an email. Yaron@yaronbrookshow.com. Yaron@yaronbrookshow.com. Send me the request for sponsorship there, and then I'll be able to tell you if the interview is on. And did you put money already, or haven't you put the money for the sponsorship on yet? Anyway, send me an email with the details of whatever it is that you did. So the reason Putin is dabbling in Latin America is not because he has any thoughts about controlling Latin America, but because he wants to support regimes that destabilize or distract the United States. This is just another foreign policy one. So Ronaldo says, Brazil is now under the cross and the sword. This year is the decisive to see if we will become socialist hell, if we have a change to evolve to a free market. Love your work. I hope that's true. I mean, I hope there is a chance to evolve to a free market. I hope there's a candidate politically who is willing to evolve Brazil into a free market. So far, Bolsonaro has been a massive disappointment in terms of movement towards a free market. Okay, we're just going to go through these from the questions from early on. Michael asked, why are pockets of intellectuals threatened by the human should and want to crush it? I don't know what that means. Why are pockets of intellectuals? I have no idea what that means, Michael. I'm sorry. Maybe ask it again for $5. Just check the grammar and put some commas in there. I don't know. I don't even understand what it says. Another question by Michael. How do you know nihilism is a real psychological motivation? Because when you introspect, you don't observe it in yourself. Well, because you observe the actions, and many of them tell you. They tell you, and you can watch somebody, and you can watch the glee and the joy and the pleasure they get from destruction. You can get the sense of how they talk about things, and then there are philosophies of nihilism. So people articulate those ideas, but you can see in how people behave their psychological motivation. Have you ever been, or would you ever go scuba diving? I actually have been scuba diving. When I was 17, I scuba dived in the Red Sea, in Sharm el-Sheikh and in Dahab. This is part of my pre-training for the Israeli SEALs, for the Israeli Navy SEALs. And as part of the pre-training, they taught us how to scuba dive, and then they took us diving in the Red Sea. It was phenomenal. I loved it. It was amazing. It was very, very exciting. I ultimately did not go to the Navy SEALs for reasons that sometime I can tell you about. And then I hurt my back, and I didn't do scuba dive again just because of the pressure the tanks put on the back. So, I wish I'd been able to continue scuba diving. It was a lot of fun. And the Red Sea maybe some of the best scuba diving in the world. I mean, the colors, the fish, the coral, unbelievable, unbelievably beautiful. Also great for snorkeling, but really amazing scuba diving. If you drive, Dave says, if you drive down A1A between West Palm Beach and Delray Beach, you'll see some incredible $200 million mansions along the coast, amazing architecture, a sign of health. Yeah. Yeah. There's some amazing mansions in Puerto Rico. They don't sell for 200 million. But yeah, Florida is doing well. I'm impressed by Florida. Very impressed by Florida. Have you ever made $2 million in 1 year? Have you ever met anyone who's made over $1 billion in 1 year? In 1 year? In 1 year? I've never made $2 million in 1 year. I think that's right. I've made more than $1 million in 1 year, but I've never made more than $2 million in 1 year. I've never met anybody who's made over $1 billion in 1 year that I know of. Now I might have, because I met Don Valentine from Sequoia Capital. It's quite possible that, I don't know, they invested in Amazon and in all kinds of other companies, and maybe when they went public, maybe they made more than $1 billion. I don't think he as an individual made more than $1 billion in 1 year. No. Did Michael Dell ever make more than $1 billion in 1 year? I've met Michael Dell, so maybe Michael Dell. How did I hurt my back? I don't know. Probably jumping around in a tank and knocking things and doing all kinds of crazy stuff like that. When I was in the Israeli army, that's when I hurt my back, in the Israeli army. Andy asks, a formal request and small insufficient incentive for a show on saving advice during stagflation. Okay, I'll do that. And related to that is Ali, I think it's Ali, asks, any idea why the stock market keep going down? Is it going to recover? It's going down because I think it was interest rates expected to go up, and the stock market, valuations of the stock market are inversely related to interest rates. As interest rates go up, the stock market goes down. And the stock market was assuming interest rates would be low forever, and valuations were way too expensive. So it's going down because given higher interest rates, it didn't make sense to be as high as it was. Some stocks were just ridiculously expensive, and it didn't make any sense for them to be that expensive, and they're adjusting back to a more normal level, a more justified level. Will they ever recover? Yeah. When? I don't know. But will they recover? Yes. Scott says, what do you think the effect of quantitative easing by the Fed will do to the stock market? Well, the quantitative easing has already happened. It's being reversed right now, but quantitative easing by the Fed helped the stock market go up because it provided enormous amounts of liquidity for people to invest in financial assets, including stocks, and they drove stock prices up. It's, that's what zero interest rates do. They provide very, very cheap capital to be able to then invest it and drive up asset prices. And when interest rates go up, less money is available to drive up asset prices. And the valuation, when you do a valuation, you discount future cash flows with based on that interest rate. And the higher the interest rate, the lower the value today is of a future dollar. And that means stock prices should be lower. Michael asked, have you been seeing these videos out of Australia, people being arrested for not having vaccine cards? I can't believe this is real life. I know. I mean, what happened in Australia, I just could never believe that it would happen in Australia. I mean, I always thought Australia is a relatively free country, a country of individualists who would stand up for their own freedom. And God, the way they're being treated by the authorities is just unbelievable. Imprisoned, arrested, put in camps, all because of COVID, all with the COVID excuse. What next? Well, the next is the excuse of climate change to oppress us and suppress us and enslave us. China is the number one, not China, sorry, Australia, number one biggest disappointment for me of 2020, 2021. It truly is depressing to see what's happening in Australia. Jeffrey says, I've been missing you live. This is for the outstanding Lex show. Thank you. Unrelated, investor is in board for Florida location. Odds might be better of seeing you there, though I hope you'll be back in New York City again. Oh, excellent. That would be cool. That would be cool. I'd be very excited about a Florida location. But I will be back in New York. I don't have the dates yet. I've got dates in May for New York, but there's a good likelihood that I'll be back in New York sometime in the next couple of months before I go to Europe. Before mid-March, I plan to go to New York. So, yeah, definitely going to do that. Let's see. Okay, cool. Oh, one more. What is your approach at attacking the socialist argument that markets in their current form do not have the capacity to be free because of enclosure? I have no idea what enclosure means. What does enclosure mean? Current form. Well, markets in their current form wouldn't exist in a free market. That is, the more free you make the markets, the more their current form is unsustainable. Their current form relies on market structures that wouldn't exist, regulations that wouldn't exist under capitalism, under free markets. Because of capture, because of market capture wouldn't exist, right? In a free market. The whole idea of a free market is separation of state from economics. The state would have no power, and therefore the state couldn't be captured because it would have no power for which to be captured. There'd be no incentive to capture the state. And yes, it's not easy to turn the world that we live in today into a free market. You would have to do so thoughtfully. Which regulations you get rid of regulations sequentially? Which ones go first? How do you establish the rule of law so that when regulations go away, you still prosecute things like fraud? But there's no limit to the capacity of the market if you allow for real freedom and if you disengage completely and ideally through constitution, the state from the economy. And then there are no capacity limitations. No capacity limitations. Ashton, if Ayn Rand were to come back to life for a day, would you sleep with her? Whoa, that's a weird question. No, I'm not sexually attracted to Ayn Rand. I admire Ayn Rand. I respect Ayn Rand. But I am not sexually attracted to her. And I would love to spend as much time as I could with Ayn Rand, but sex is different. Romantic love is different. You don't just fall in love with everybody you admire or the person you admire most. She asked the question, I answered it. So, as you can see on the Yaron Brooks show, if you put a dollar amount to the question, you can pretty much ask me anything. This is a real, not a pseudo, not a pretend. This is a real AMA where I will answer pretty much, there are limits, I think, pretty much any question. Ashton says she was joking. Well, you have to put I'm joking, don't answer this. Because as I said, it's not an issue of beauty. I'm not attracted to her partially, I'd say partially, because, I don't know, it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. If I spent an evening talking to her, would I be sexually attracted to her? I don't know. But sexual attraction is different than admiration. Sexual attraction is different than, and romantic love is different than admiration. It's different than relief. I mean, I was going to say that partially it's because of how much smarter she is than me. And by that standard, I don't know who could fall in love with her. I'm not a genius, and I know that. And my wife is not in the room. Gene Walter says, Johan, if your wife was in the room when answering the last question, no, she wasn't. She might be watching. I mean, because I'm not home. I'm in Florida. She's in Puerto Rico, but maybe she's watching this on YouTube. I don't know. Yeah, that's Volga Wolf's Den. It's beneath you. Anyway, it's not funny. Yes, sex is very complicated, as Jose says, and romantic love is very complicated, and but I would look up to Ayn Rand too much, I think, to be sexually attracted to her. She's just so much smarter than, in terms of a genius level smart. All right. Well, we're at 700, almost 750, $25, and we're at 750, which is, kind of the high end of our goals lately. All right. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. And I will see you all. I don't know. It depends on when I'm leaving Florida. But I will see you all certainly on Friday, maybe on Wednesday, not on Thursday, not on Tuesday. Have a great night, everybody, and let's hope that at the end of the day, Putin is too much of a coward to invade Ukraine. I'm with the Ukrainians. Free Ukraine. Bye, everybody.